What's good? It's Woog, a former two-time unified heavyweight champion and boxing superstar looking to forge a new path to glory. We've got Anthony Joshua, 24 wins and 3 losses, taking on Jermaine Franklin, 21 wins and 1 loss. This is Anthony Joshua's first fight since his back-to-back decision losses to Alexander Usyk. And yes, the heavyweight division has grown increasingly frustrating in the recent weeks as they have been unable or unwilling to secure the Tyson Fury versus Alexander Usyk battle for undisputed. So these titles and their destinations are somewhat uncertain. It looks like Usyk is probably going to have to face his mandatory challenger in Daniel Dubois, and who knows what Tyson Fury's about to do. But unfortunately, it looks like we are not getting Fury versus Usyk. So one of the other major happenings in the heavyweight division is Anthony Joshua's return to the ring, and man, Alexander Usyk's emergence at heavyweight has been such a spoiler for Anthony Joshua's career. Remember, they were about to make Tyson Fury versus Anthony Joshua, and I'm not talking about just this past December. I'm talking about before Deontay Wilder activated the rematch clause that triggered the third fight between Fury and Wilder, and then Anthony Joshua then had to fight his mandatory Alexander Usyk. I mean, that was such a monkey wrench in Anthony Joshua's plans. And, you know, he really paid for it career-wise, back-to-back losses against somebody who was perceived as, you know, the undisputed cruiserweight champion, but then moving up to heavyweight and beating Anthony Joshua twice. And so Anthony Joshua is returning to the ring, and he is now working under the tutelage of Derrick James. Anthony Joshua has been out in Texas training with Derrick James, and we all really want to see what the benefits of that are going to look like. I mean, a lot of people kind of give Anthony Joshua a hard time in terms of trying to overanalyze his confidence levels, the dog in him. And I think that a lot of that started a long time ago when he was an Olympic gold medalist who was kind of working up the ranks, and he was just this like kind of muscle-bound young man and a good-looking young man and somebody who, you know, treated opponents with respect, wasn't a huge trash talker, you know, smiled a lot in interviews. And I just think that there was a lot of skepticism on how much of a tough guy this really is. And we knew that he could punch hard. I mean, he had a 100% KO ratio throughout a significant portion of his career. It wasn't until he fought Joseph Parker that he was even taking the distance. But then over time, we saw him with his, I wouldn't call it a coming of age fight, but it was a passing of the torch, so to speak, when he beat Vladimir Klitschko in a great fight, stopping Klitschko in 2017. That was kind of the kingmaker for Anthony Joshua. I mean, he was a popular fighter before that, but when he stopped Vladimir Klitschko, he became kind of a superstar. And then, you know, we saw him tested against Joseph Parker, Alexander Povetkin, and he was coming out on top. And then obviously the fight against Andy Ruiz happened in Madison Square Garden, and that, you know, kind of changed the reputation of Anthony Joshua because of the way he got knocked down 4 times and just his body language. And then he did come back to his credit and beat Andy Ruiz via decision, but it was a much more careful style of fighting. And a lot of people don't think that Anthony Joshua has been the same, or as Chris Mannix famously put it, a composed and ferocious finisher. I don't know if Anthony Joshua has been that same fighter for the past couple of years. And his last 2 wins are in 2019 and 2020, the first of which was that rematch against Andy Ruiz, and then he beat Kubrat Pulev about a year later, December of 2020, after that long 2020 COVID year. So Anthony Joshua has been doing a lot more losing than winning in recent years. He's lost 3 out of his last 5 fights. So I do feel like a reset is kind of in order. I mean, Canelo just came off of arguably his worst year last year, right? Where he lost to Dimitri Bivol and had a less than spectacular fight against Triple G in their trilogy fight. And then obviously the hand surgery. So Canelo is hitting a reset with that upcoming fight against John Ryder. And for, you know, different reasons, Anthony Joshua is hitting a bit of a reset himself and is kind of setting up the, you know, the next chapter and maybe the last chapter of a very good career. And so Jermaine Franklin is the B-side, a clear B-side in this fight. And yes, Jermaine Franklin did show out in that last fight against Dillian White, where Franklin lost a close and somewhat disputed decision. I mean, a lot of people thought that Jermaine Franklin might have deserved the decision win. I thought that, you know, Dillian White probably edged it, but it was a very close and competitive fight. It was a very good look for Jermaine Franklin, who was, little known before that. I mean, he's a good fighter. You could look at his past fights against Rydell Booker and against Jerry Forrest, and he's clearly a good, sound fighter, but the jury's still out on where Dillian Whyte is right now in his career. And so we don't really know what to make of how good Jermaine Franklin is or can be. But for this Anthony Joshua reset, I think some people are figuring that maybe Anthony Joshua's confidence is so low, and Jermaine Franklin, even though he's coming off the first loss of his career, is actually riding a wave of confidence. I mean, that fight against Dillian Whyte did a lot to instill even more confidence in Jermaine Franklin, kind of confirming, yeah, I do belong here. But if you look at these fighter styles in AJ and Jermaine Franklin, I feel like we are about to see Jermaine Franklin kind of hit a clear ceiling. I mean, it's one thing if you're, fighting the likes of Jerry Forrest, who we just saw get totally cleaned up by Jared Anderson. And then after that, Jermaine Franklin beat Rodney Moore and Pavel Sauer. But those guys are nowhere near on the planet that Anthony Joshua is from a physical gift standpoint, from a technical standpoint. And then you couple that with, Anthony Joshua training with Derek James. I feel like this fight between Joshua and Franklin might take on a bit of a Vladimir Klitschko versus the clear B-sides in a significant portion of Klitschko's career type of feel. And what do I mean by that? Well, when Klitschko lost to Corey Sanders and then a few fights later lost to Layman Brewster, he then had a fight after he linked up with Emmanuel Stewart where it was against Samuel Peter, and Klitschko was in all types of trouble, but they righted the ship mid-fight. And then Vladimir Klitschko turned the tide and, ended up wobbling Samuel Peter and ended up winning that fight. To me, that was a switch that was flipped on Vladimir Klitschko's career, where he then went on a tremendous run from 2005 all the way up to his loss to Tyson Fury in 2015, a 10-year stretch. And for the first half of that 10-year stretch, he was just devastating guys like Chris Bird, very good fighter in Chris Bird, but that was a bludgeoning. And then against Ray Austin, 2 fights later, just before that against Calvin Brock. But the dynamic that we had was that you would have the very tall, especially by that day's and that era's standards, you would have the 6'6" Vladimir Klitschko keeping the opponents way out with the jab, and sometimes he would hold when they would get in tight, especially in that fight against Alexander Povetkin. But you would have somewhat boring fights. I mean, not that Chris Bird fight. That was a butt whooping. That was tough to watch. But you would have the clearly more skilled and physically more gifted Vladimir Klitschko working from the outside with the jab. And then it's one of those where you watching the fight, you're just kind of checking your watch like, damn, like this thing is just kind of carrying on. And then at a certain point of the fight, Vladimir Klitschko would start sitting on his right hand, drilling the opponent. Then you would see them buckle and then get dropped. And then Vladimir Klitschko, way more times than not, would end up stopping his opponents. I feel like Anthony Joshua versus Jermaine Franklin, because yes, Jermaine Franklin is a skilled fighter and he's got better than advertised head movement. He's a pretty good counterpuncher. He's very good at reacting. Like, you do something, I'm going to do something to counter that. And that could work to a point. I mean, Dillian Whyte is what, about 6'4"? But when you're talking about the 6'6"-ish, Anthony Joshua, like Vladimir Klitschko, it's a different dynamic. You can't be the guy who's waiting for the other guy to make a move and make a mistake for you to then counter, especially if you don't have the legs of Alexander Usyk. I almost feel like these losses for Anthony Joshua against Usyk are a little bit misleading. It's a little bit of an illusion because Jermaine Franklin doesn't have Alexander Usyk's legs. You watch Alexander Usyk's feet during any one of his fights, especially if you go back to his cruiserweight days. Look at how he moves his feet. It's sublime, not to mention his head movement and all of his body dips, dipping at the waist and being able to slip jabs with that type of head movement. And you couple that with the feet movement, it's a Rubik's Cube, and it's very unique. It's a very unique challenge that Anthony Joshua, I mean, he wasn't blown out, but he wasn't able to solve that riddle in 2 fights. Jermaine Franklin isn't the same type of challenge. He doesn't have the same type of footwork. I think that we're going to see Jermaine Franklin, again, I'm not saying that he's not a good fighter, but footwork wise, he's going to be sitting on the outside. I feel like he's going to get popped by one jab after another. And then it comes down to, Well, what does Anthony Joshua feel comfortable with putting on top of that jab? Is it going to be something where he doesn't really start sitting on his power punches until late like he did against Kubrat Pulev? Or will he be satisfied with fighting a point fight like he did against Andy Ruiz? Not to say that he wasn't putting power punches behind the jabs against Ruiz, but he wasn't going in there to finish the fight. He just didn't want a pocket to form where Andy Ruiz could then start letting his hands go. I think that Anthony Joshua is going to be winning the early rounds here. I think Jermaine Franklin is going to have some interesting moments, perhaps. But because Jermaine Franklin is a bit more stationary, and he was fighting a stationary Dillian Whyte who doesn't, or at least this version of Dillian Whyte, doesn't move his feet like he used to. Dillian Whyte used to move better like when he was fighting Lucas Brown or Robert Helenius back in the day. No, Dillian Whyte doesn't move like that now. He's more comfortable with just kind of standing there. I mean, that's what fighters do as they age. They start moving less. Your legs are the first to go, along with maybe reflexes, speed, but you get what I'm saying. But Anthony Joshua, again, is not going to have to solve the same types of riddles here. So I think that he's going to win the early rounds. I think he's going to pop Jermaine Franklin with the jabs. I don't think he's going to go super heavy with a lot of firepower in the early rounds. I think he's going to be somewhat cautious. He's going to be implementing the Derrick James and Anthony Joshua game plan. I think he's going to look a little bit like Errol Spence in some regard. The type of Errol Spence that's operating behind the jab and that's acting a little more patient than he does in some of his other fights. So I know Errol Spence is a southpaw, but I'm talking Errol Spence versus Danny Garcia, Errol Spence versus Mikey Garcia, where you're fighting the clearly smaller guy who's gonna have to be the person to make a move to get into the pocket. So what is Jermaine Franklin gonna do if it's Anthony Joshua who's more or less content with fighting a distance fight with the superior reach? We're talking 82-inch reach for Anthony Joshua to Jermaine Franklin's 77-inch reach. So you couple that dynamic with the height, Jermaine Franklin's going to have to close the gap. And I do think that he's going to look a little bit like one of vintage Vladimir Klitschko's opponents. Now, will Anthony Joshua then put a lot of firepower on top of that? How comfortable will he be letting his hands go? Well, I do think that he's going to start getting a little bit more aggressive. Maybe he drops Jermaine Franklin at a certain point, but I don't see him finishing Jermaine Franklin. I don't know if he's there confidence-wise yet. Now, if he does finish Jermaine Franklin, that would be a good look. And, you could kind of take your pick in terms of who Anthony Joshua can be set to fight after that. Will it be Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder? Or will it be somebody who's a little bit more scaled down like this version of Dillian Whyte? Well, we don't know, but I don't see Jermaine Franklin upsetting Anthony Joshua. I see him maybe having another good outing. I don't think he's going to look as good or fight as evenly against Anthony Joshua as he did against Dillian Whyte. I don't think it's going to, this is going to be a clear winner. Anthony Joshua. I just don't know if it's going to be via decision or via stoppage. I was thinking maybe via stoppage because of the increased comfortability that he'll have. And then, he'll be going back to the corner, hearing the voice of a new trainer, Derrick James, kind of coach him up between rounds. Maybe he wears Jermaine Franklin down in the early and middle rounds, and then Jermaine Franklin doesn't have the same durability in the late rounds. Maybe he starts getting worn down to where he's now, he has to do something, so he feels a little bit more urgent. He, being Franklin, can then run into power punches from Anthony Joshua. And I do think that Jermaine Franklin's ability to survive the full 12 against Joshua will also be determined on how many chances Jermaine Franklin will be willing to take. Well, I think that he's going to fight a spirited fight until he maybe feels the power of some of the power punches to where he starts dialing it back a little bit, saying, okay, maybe we try to figure this out from distance and maybe I stay on my P's and Q's defensively and come away with the decision loss rather than getting knocked out by Anthony Joshua, who has a king-size punch. It's just a question of, is he as comfortable as he was back in the day in letting his hands go and using that power? Well, I think that he's going to start trending towards that, but I don't think he's going to stop Jermaine Franklin. I think he's going to win a clear, unanimous decision. I think he's going to look pretty good in doing so. He might even, again, score a knockdown or something like that, but it will be a good kind of a comeback fight for Anthony Joshua. I do think so. And I do think that this is going to be a successful debuting of the pairing that is Anthony Joshua and Derrick James. So it's going to be interesting to see how that coupling evolves over time. But yeah, let me know what you think about Anthony Joshua versus Jermaine Franklin. Am I not giving Jermaine Franklin enough of a shot in this one? The odds makers certainly aren't. I mean, Anthony Joshua is a -800 to Jermaine Franklin's +750. So Joshua is is a 8-to-1 favorite, at least on oddschecker.com. But a lot of people seem to take away from that Dillian Whyte versus Jermaine Franklin fight that Jermaine Franklin is like an elite or near elite-ish fighter. I'm like, I mean, we'll see, but I have more questions on where Dillian Whyte is than I am convinced that Jermaine Franklin is an elite or a near elite fighter. That is to be determined. We'll see. I'm not going to write him off, but I'm also not going to pick him to beat Anthony Joshua. So I'm taking Joshua, but I'm taking him via clear decision. I'm talking something like 10 rounds to 2, something like that. A wide gap on the scorecards. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Who do you see winning? How? And where does the heavyweight division go from here? Like, is Usyk going to defend his title or titles? He's got 3 of the belts against Daniel Dubois. Will Tyson Fury fight again? Is he going to retire? Is he going to just sit back and wait for this Joshua versus Jermaine Franklin fight to play out and then call out AJ? Is that going to be the play for Tyson Fury? And where does Deontay Wilder factor in? Do they finally get Deontay Wilder versus Andy Ruiz done? I just have a lot of questions about the direction of the heavyweight division, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.